if Biden gets elected, comes in is, I think he has a more, he preaches that the US role internationally, even while we acknowledge the rise of other countries in Europe, in China and even in Europe, would be better in that way. So there might be a position to reset and to start to build those things again. But what I'd like to think about Kenyans is, about Africans and everything else, is that none of these administrations veer too far from what the interest of their own people is. So if we'd like the US to take any posture in a global matter that concerns the East African community, for instance, then it's upon us to build a diplomatic capability and be serious enough to be taken seriously to tell them, look, we think we can persuade you to work together with us to achieve this or that goal. So relying entirely on whether a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, or a libertarian gets elected is to rely too much on domestic politics to sort out global issues. And I think that's where maybe African countries need to do better, whether through the AU or its own configurations. I think is a lesson we must go through. I think that's a fantastic question for two reasons. One, we have analyzed over the last 5 years, actually 6 years, the trade balance between Kenya and the US favors Kenya. Kenya exports more to the US in terms of trade value than we get from the US. The only year when it happened recently was, I think, sometime in 2005 or 6 when the Kenya Airways bought huge planes from Seattle, right, from Boeing. So the structure of trade between Kenya and the US is actually very interesting because it's in Kenya's favor. Why? Kenya exports a lot of textiles and agricultural produce. There might be a concern, which is genuine, about the possibility of US agriculture coming to compete Kenyan farms here. And that should be on the table, and I saw it on the negotiating principles negotiated by them. But the reason it would be a good place for Kenya to start an FTA is also because, contrary to what public thinking is, actually, the trade volume is small and it can be grown substantially. But Kenya has an advantage so far. So really, that's part of the reason why we have confidence. The main goal should actually to increase volumes of exports either way. I also think that one of the things that a trade agreement is not only about exports, it's also about importers and consumers. Right. Kenyans also want cheaper goods and services. So whether you're buying sneakers or whatever it is that comes from the States, Kenyans would like to get it at a much cheaper cost than having it travel to Europe and then brought back here. And if this free trade area opens up, the possibilities of direct flights from one way to the other and shipping connections, then that will happen. So that's part of the reason why I think the Ministry of Trade is clear that we should move with confidence. We are able to actually see what Kenya's commercial interests in. And Kenya's commercial interests cannot be the interests of a single firm. It must be the interest of Kenyans globally and obviously expanding that. So we at the Institute of Economic Affairs think, yes, I think the content of the trade agreement will matter, but there's no reason why Kenya could not complete. If possible, through the ESC, but also ESC rules allow Kenyans, as read today, to actually complete a trade agreement, a free trade area with the US on its own. Right. Yeah. I think the government of President Trump, whatever we might think about his rough and impolite language, has provided an opportunity for Kenya to go into a free trade area with the US. That's a good thing, irrespective of my own personal feelings or somebody else's personal feelings about President Trump, his administration, and some of the communication that is uncomfortable to some ears. It's a good thing. Why? Because it's telling Kenya, here are the objectives for the negotiation. It is not possible because the AGOA initiative, which is a one-sided initiative by the US, dependent on the discretion of a president, and which is not compatible with WTO rules, will come to an end sooner than later. So what that means is Kenya is being provided an opportunity to negotiate terms with the US government for a free trade area. That's a good thing. Regardless of what other people say, it's a good thing. So basically, Kenya will state its negotiating objectives. This will be negotiated. It might not happen quickly, but that opportunity is available and was presented when the president visited the US is a good thing. So if you start it on that, whatever. Now, people are concerned about what the content will be. That's good. But it's in the interest of Kenyans, business groups, everybody else to analyze the content to ensure that the content that makes it to that free trade arrangement is useful for Kenya, but also useful for consumers, because consumers also consume stuff that comes from the US, and for exporters who send stuff to the US. Right. That is. I think President Trump as well has not, in many ways, extended wars. He claims that his commitment to terrorism remains, but he has not extended wars. And a couple of weeks back, President Trump decided, negotiating with the government of Sudan to the north of Kenya, and has restored relations. That too is a good thing. Now, whether there should have been a precondition for the recognition of Israel, which Kenya recognizes as well, I don't think that's a bad thing. Why? Because African countries have to be careful about being centers for terrorism, because we might think that it's the US's business, but that kind of terrorism tends to flow back into the continent, and we can tell already it is here. So that kind of diplomacy, regardless of whether people thought President Trump would go about it, I think you have to give his bureaucrats in the State Department, who tend to be non-partisan to a large extent, credit for trying to secure that and to get relations between one African country with the US to go on as well. So it's a mixed bag, the truth be said. We have to question President Trump's his administration's last-minute move to actually block Ngozi Iweala's appointment by consensus to be the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Nobody doubts that she's competent. I mean, she's worked at the World Bank, she knows the stuff, and I read her statements and everything else. And there was going to be a consensus around that, but the US has blocked it, just at the time that the US was also looking inward. So President Trump's inward look for a big economy should worry countries such as Kenya, which are stepping out to actually build trade and global political diplomacy around the world. I think US leadership for its own weaknesses is still needed. And the fact that the WTO, the Dispute Settlement Board, which requires the approval of the US President and US Congress, has not happened because President Trump doesn't think much about it, is also one thing.